functions lambda. Okay, we learned about here how to use lambda functions. So, and one more point we discussed about technically how we can handle function overloads and what are the limitations and rules for function overloading. So that is the basic point we need to understand. Okay. So about all these function related options. So in a class, three important members we have discussed now. There is properties, constructor, accessors, and functions. So the basic members of a class and how to configure them. Next, after understanding this, another important point. Now we need to understand about code reusability. Code reusability. So code reusability, it is one of the key feature of object-oriented programming. It is one of the key feature of object-oriented programming. So it is a technique that allows to reuse the code written in one entity. It is a technique that allows to reuse the code written in one entity in another entity. That means the code written in one entity can be reused in another entity. Here entity means you can simply say that class. So entity means class. Entity means class. Technically, how we can reuse the members of one class in another class without rewriting them. So that means you can reuse the members of one class in another class. We can reuse the members of one class in another class. And important in object-oriented programming, so you can achieve reusability. Or you can implement reusability. In object-oriented programming, you can implement reusability by using two techniques. A, we call as aggregation. Another one by using inheritance. Technically, in object-oriented programming, you can implement code reusability by using two methods. One is aggregation, another one is inheritance. That means how you can reuse the code. That means how you can access the code of one entity in another entity. There are two techniques in object-oriented programming. One is aggregation, another one inheritance. Actually, aggregation is nothing but, so what is aggregation? Aggregation is nothing but, it is a technique. It is a technique that uses object to object communication. Object to object communication. Aggregation is a technique which uses object to object communication. So it uses a mechanism called has a relation. It uses a mechanism called has a relation technically. That means in this technique, without creating any relationship between classes, we can access the members of one class in another. That means in aggregation technique, so without creating any relationship between classes, we can access the members of one class in another class. When we create relationship between classes, then problem is the members of one class may conflict with the members of another class. It leads to hiding, overriding. So without maintaining any relationship between classes, we must able to access the members of one class in another class. We actually call this mechanism as aggregation. In object-oriented programming, aggregation is a technique where you can reuse the code without any relationship between the classes, right? So how this is possible? That is what we generally call as has a relation. So how this is possible? How we can implement aggregation? So what is aggregation and how we can implement aggregation? So let's see how to implement this aggregation. Right? So we will use a simple technique of aggregation. Let's see how we can manage that aggregation, right? One second. Yes, sir. So how we can manage the technique, how we can handle the aggregation concept. So aggregation is nothing but we are maintaining, without maintaining the relationship between the classes, we are accessing the members of one class in another class. That's what actually the